In 2001, former Goldman Sachs executive Jim O'Neill created the term BRIC countries to identify Brazil, Russia, India, and China as top emerging powers. South Africa would later join the group in 2010, thus giving the acronym BRICS its last letter. Together, the BRICS cover around 40% of the world's population and more than 25% of the world's land. In rough terms, we can divide the group into two: those who took advantage of globalization to integrate themselves into global supply chains, like India and China, and those who used globalization to sell their abundant natural resources, like Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. This week, the leaders of the 5 countries meet in the 10th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. The summit happens in a particular time, with Brazil struggling to recover from its worst recession on record, Russia facing accusations of meddling with the American 2016 election, and China waging a trade war with the United States. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, and this is Explaining Brazil. So, what should we expect from the 2018 BRICS Summit? What will be considered a success? To discuss Brazil and the BRICS, I'm joined today by Oliver Stuenkel, a professor at Fundação Getulio Vargas, Brazil's leading think tank, and author of The BRICS and the Future of Global Order. Hello, Professor. It's good to have you back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Professor, while the term BRIC countries was created in 2001, these countries started meeting and acting in a more coordinated fashion much later. For our listeners who are not familiar with what the BRICS are and why this group exists, could you help me with a brief explanation of their history, please?
Well, the BRICS grouping, as you said, was coined. The term BRICS was coined in 2001 by Jim O'Neill, investment banker at Goldman Sachs, who pointed to a profound shift in the economic order, global order, saying that in the long term, the Western dominance, the Western economic dominance would be a thing of the past, and that those countries would have an increasingly important role. Then the financial crisis came in 2008, and it was during that time that the BRICS countries, actually decided to provide a political dimension to the grouping, that there would be a benefit in starting to coordinate some activities. And it was really the financial crisis that initiated a more institutionalized framework of cooperation, as back then that the BRICS countries started to align their positions and seek potential points of consensus prior to negotiations at the World Bank and the IMF. So they jointly coordinated the effort to provide more liquidity of capital to those institutions.
I'm sorry, those efforts include the new development bank based in Shanghai?
That came later. Actually, it was mostly initially this moment of cooperation to deal with the financial crisis, that the BRICS countries realized that there would be potential to work together, that they could benefit from working together. And you ran a process of including South Africa in 2010. And after that, really, every year, other areas of cooperations were added. It's now, it's still a fairly new grouping in the sense that it's still in flux. It's still new activities that are being added. In 2013, you had initial debates about the creation of a development bank, which was then actually created in 2015. And nowadays you have around 50 to 70 meetings throughout the year in many areas, and a big presidential summit that takes place this week in Johannesburg, which is the 10th time they meet. But there's also many areas of cooperation, be it in education, in defense, national security, where these countries for the first time have a institutionalized platform to discuss a potential for cooperation.
You wrote in an article for America's Quarterly that this BRICS Summit is a golden opportunity for Brazil. Why is that?
Because of the internal challenges it faces, both politically and economically, it is necessary for this government, but particularly for the next one, to use the platform of the BRICS Summit to articulate to the international community how it seeks to overcome those international challenges. It is a privileged platform that provides Brazil with access to key decision makers from India, from Russia, from China, from South Africa, all countries that will play a very important role, of course, above all, India and China. So I think Brazil, in that sense, despite its current crisis, it maintains membership of this grouping and really has the privileged opportunity to participate in debates about the role that Asia will play in global affairs in the coming years. So in that sense, I think it is very important not only to be there, but also to articulate clear proposals of what should be discussed at the summit. Brazil will hold the temporary presidency of the BRICS grouping starting next year. So its temporary successor will host the 11th BRICS Summit in Brasilia next year, and that, again, will be a tremendous opportunity to show what the next government's plans are to deal with the ongoing challenges. So I think it's really a grouping that generates little cost for Brazil, but which holds a lot of potential benefits.
And you mentioned it's important not only to be there, but to be active there. But Brazil has not necessarily been the most active BRICS member, has it, in the past?
You're absolutely right. I think nowadays the key countries that give new impulses are India, China, and to some extent Russia. South Africa, change of government, a lot of corruption scandals, a lot of instability, and Brazil, also economic crisis, political uncertainty, have been rather quiet. And I think that's certainly a problem because the other countries understand how useful that is. You now have, as you initially pointed out, a crisis in the West, a deep division of unprecedented magnitude between the United States and Europe, a vacuum of power, very significant uncertainty of who is willing and able to take the lead internationally. And in that sense, I think the BRICS have a tremendous opportunity. They represent a significant part of the international community. Despite the crisis in South Africa, Russia, and Brazil, the total economic size of the BRICS countries today is larger than what Jim O'Neill had initially predicted in 2001. So the BRICS are the main providers of global public growth. That gives them a lot of legitimacy to articulate new opinions on issues like inequality, development, etc. So I think it would be important. Brazil does have specific interests, particularly when it comes to its relationship to China. I think there's a need to overcome the difficulties that exist, for example, the trade system and the World Trade Organization between China and Brazil. And there's a crisis in Venezuela that is beginning to affect Brazil, and where you have Russia and China as very important partners of the Venezuelan regime, and where I think Brazil must make clear that those two countries must take the lead in the process of helping Venezuela overcome the current crisis which it finds itself in.
You mentioned Asia's role in the global stage and also in the Latin American stage. Brazil, for a long time, has claimed that position of regional leader, but has done little to live up to that status. And in the recent years, China has arrived with big investments in Brazil, but elsewhere as well, in Peru, in other countries. And Brazil has kind of seen that movement with a lot of complacency. Is that true, or how do you see the way that Brazil is approaching China's rising influence in Latin America?
Well, I think the key problem is that in Brazil, there's a lack of knowledge about China and what it means to operate in a Chinese-centric world. We lack sinologists. We lack the people on the ground in China that can allow us not only to understand but to anticipate developments in China. And I think that leaves Brazil largely unprepared for the, I think, most momentous geopolitical change that's taking place in Latin America, which is the arrival of China. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think it's a very complex development, which brings positive aspects, but also potentially negative aspects, which requires that Brazil's regional strategy must adapt. And I think unless we develop a greater expertise about China, we will fail to articulate a clear strategy for South America, because today the major competitor for Brazil is China in many countries in the region. But at the same time, China is also a very important partner, and I think that seen from outside, Brazil has certainly not been able to project stability in the region. And I think for a lot of Chinese investors in Latin America, Brazil is not really a country that has played a constructive role in providing stability. A lot of concerns about the spread of Lava Jato in the region and about what that could mean, but also a clear perception that Brazil is currently unable to prevent or address crises in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in that sense, or Haiti, where you all have instability occurring. So I think that is perhaps today the most dramatic or the most urgent Brazilian foreign policy challenge. And that's why I think it's important for Brazil to prioritize BRICS, because it should also be a platform where Brazil can address its grievances and its ideas to China when it comes to Latin America.
Come the end of this summit, what will be considered a success? What must Brazil achieve during these meetings with foreign leaders? What must President Temer achieve in order for his last participation in the BRICS Summit to be considered a success?
Well, it's always, in a way, difficult to measure the exact outcomes of these summits. I mean, you, of course, could say that the outcome of the recent G7 summit was clearly not a success because you didn't have the United States signing the final declaration. The BRICS usually prepare the declarations in a way that they will be signed. It's very staged. But there's also some space for presidents to meet one-on-one. I think the key task for the Brazilian government is to show that despite the current unpredictability, the government's weakness, which of course all the other summit participants are aware of. They know that of all these BRICS presidents, Temer is the weakest one right now. That despite all this, Brazil remains committed to the grouping, that Brazil will hold the presidency and will not be just a placeholder, but will actually seek to influence the grouping, and it has a group of thinkers that is actively engaged in discussing possibilities for the grouping. I think specifically, it's necessary for the president to advance the debate between Brazil and China, where there's issues about accusations of anti-dumping, dumping actually by Brazil, of concern in China about the competitiveness of some Brazilian products. I think these things need to be addressed. There needs to be a better channel of communication to the Chinese government. Must be made clear that while Brazil is happy about our investment, about greater trade with China, that this must be, this must take place eye to eye in a fair context. And the second thing is, I think that the president must make clear to both the president of Russia and China that they have a role to play in Venezuela. Brazil is currently bearing the brunt of this crisis, together with several other countries in the region. That countries like China or Russia could no longer, just play a minor political role and say that they have no responsibility to address the crisis, but they must actively, I think, work with both the Venezuelan government and the opposition and neighboring countries to find ways to contain both the humanitarian crisis, but also articulate a way for Venezuela to initiate a process of reconstruction and of political renewal which will be essential to overcome the crisis.
In terms of Brazil-China relations, yesterday on Monday, July 23, China's ambassador to Brasilia said that he wanted both countries to reach new levels of trading and cooperation. But that comes after China recently slapped more tariffs on Brazilian poultry and sugar. Brazil plans to take these cases to the World Trade Organization. How strained are these two countries' relationship right now, if they are?
Well, there are certainly issues, particularly in the trade area, that must be addressed. I think at some point, to my sense, I think perhaps the Brazilian government must show that these are clear priorities. These are issues that need to be addressed directly at the BRICS Summit. I wouldn't say the relationship is strained because I think to some extent also those issues are natural. Two big economies that they have those issues going on. That Brazil has issues, similar issues with several other countries. But I think in that sense it's necessary for the Brazilian government also to call out China sometimes, which likes to portray itself as kind of a very open economy that defends globalization. But I think in several cases we see that China is not that open after all, and it makes things also a bit difficult for Brazil. So I think you have that as a potential negative factor. At the same time, I think Brazil benefits a lot from Chinese investment in Latin America as a whole. And I think if it knows how to negotiate this, I think it'd be a tremendous step forward for South America if it's able to use these investments in a way to improve its infrastructure, to reduce inequality, and to become more productive and competitive in the international economy.
The BRICS are made of 5 countries that are extremely different among themselves. Different economies, societies, and interests. How much do these countries walk in the same direction?
I think in many ways they're different, and I think the BRICS grouping will not help them eliminate all these issues. You have border conflicts, for example, between China and India. You have authoritarian regimes in China and Russia, where we have democratic rule in Brazil, South Africa, and India. So these obviously create hurdles which must be recognized and they must be dealt with. That's reality. But I think in many ways, the challenges, the problems and development challenges, for example, that the BRICS countries face are sometimes quite similar, despite the fact that the BRICS countries are situated in very different parts of the world. So I think there's a lot to learn from each other. I think China, despite its very different political system, has achieved growth rates that hold some important lessons for developing countries like Brazil. I think they have in several areas common interests, not in all areas. But in a way, I think that for Brazil, the kind of cooperation that takes place in BRICS is the kind of cooperation that will dominate the 21st century, which is cooperation between very different countries, not a lot of non-Western countries, countries that have a lot of internal challenges, that also are still unsure about their role in the international order, and that it is necessary to find ways to cooperate between countries that are very different. In that sense, I think the BRICS is a harbinger, a sign of what is to come. I think the BRICS must work together on issues like trade. They must reduce non-tariff barriers. I think there's a lot of potential for BRICS countries to trade more between themselves. But there's a lot of non-tariff barriers where they also, I think, must advance. It's still tremendously difficult, for example, the visa regime between the BRICS countries is still fairly complex. Recognition of diplomas is still not working very well. Several other issues that make cooperation complicated. But I think slowly they're advancing. I think multilateral issues also, when they can agree on things, then if they are able to speak with one voice, they are quite influential. So I think in the long term, several areas of cooperation. Development is one big one. You have the new development bank, which will play a more important role in the next years. So I think the cooperation will always be sector specific. It will never be all-encompassing. But that's, I think, the new reality of the multipolar world, where Brazil must have, or can have, excellent ties with BRICS, with the European Union, with OECD, with Mexico, with the United States. It is really one key element in Brazil's strategy for a more multipolar world.
Thank you very much, Professor. Is there anything that maybe we left out of this discussion and you think it's important to mention and it's important to remember about the BRICS Summit that we'll have this week?
Well, I think it is quite interesting, Professor, the last point, that I have accompanied the public debates about BRICS in India, Russia, South Africa, and China, countries I've visited over the past 10 years frequently. And I think it is noteworthy that the Brazilian media, academia, politics, the private sector, the country as a whole, remains, I think, unaware of the profound ways in which the world will change as Asia is rising and as the West will no longer play the dominant role it has once played. And I think in the consequence of that, the BRICS grouping is seen as something a bit quixotic, not really much relevance, because we tend to be very focused onto the United States, on the North Atlantic in general, But I think the reality is that it's not a choice, but it's a necessity to adapt to this new reality. It doesn't mean we have to agree with the other BRICS members on a lot of things. But I think the real silence, previous to summits, the lack of a public debate, the lack of more academic production on that topic, shows that what really is needed is a much broader shift. There must be, I think, a much broader understanding that the world has changed, that it's necessary to invest to overcome the knowledge gap when it comes to discussing Russia, India, South Africa, and China. And so in that sense, I hope that next year's summit will be an opportunity for the new government to really prioritize this. And also think about how to shift the strategic orientation of the country as a whole. And that's something that goes much beyond government and involves all parts of society.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a pleasure to have you back to our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you like this podcast, please take a look at our website. It's Brazilian.report. Every day we have new content about Brazil's politics, economics, and society. We also have exclusive newsletter services if you want to be briefed on what's going on in Brazil before starting your day. Subscribe now to our free trial and enjoy all of our content for 14 days. It's really free. You don't have to put any credit card information. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle is @Brazilian Report. That's all for now. See you next week.